The wind carried secrets through the Montana wilderness, whispering through towering pines that had witnessed a century of human folly. In the distance, storm clouds gathered like an angry congregation, promising a blizzard that would bury the land in white silence. Against this backdrop of impending fury, a lone figure moved with deadly purpose through the frozen landscape. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Cross had built his reputation on one simple principle. He never missed his target. Not once in 12 years of tracking fugitives across the American frontier had he returned empty-handed. His weathered face bore the scars of 1,000 confrontations, each line etched by wind, sun, and the weight of choices that haunted quiet men in quiet moments. At 38, he possessed the lean efficiency of a wolf and the cold determination of winter itself. The letter in his coat pocket crinkled against his ribs with each step, its official seal already broken, its message burned into his memory. The paper bore the letterhead of Judge Hamilton Blackwood, a man whose word carried the weight of law across 3 territories. The contract was simple, brutal, and paid better than anything Cross had taken in months. $1,000 for a single bullet. $1,000 to end the life of a woman who had brought shame upon one of the territory's most prominent families. Cross paused at the edge of a frozen creek, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter air. He pulled the letter from his pocket and read it again, though he knew every word by heart. Elena Rodriguez, he murmured, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. Age 22. Height approximately 5 feet 4 inches. Dark hair brown. Eyes, distinguishing mark, small scar above left eyebrow. The clinical description continued, but it was the final paragraph that had drawn him to this godforsaken wilderness. Subject fled from lawful marriage ceremony to Senator William Garrett on December 15th. Has stolen family heirlooms valued at over $2,000. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. Elimination authorized by territorial statute. 247B payment upon proof of death. Cross folded the letter and returned it to his coat. In his line of work, he had learned not to ask too many questions about motivation. Dead was dead, and money was money. The frontier was littered with the bones of men and women who had made choices that led them down dark paths. If Elena Rodriguez had chosen to cross Senator Garrett, she had chosen poorly. The storm was moving faster than he had anticipated. Already, fat snowflakes began to drift down from the gray sky, landing on his shoulders like cold whispers of what was to come. Cross adjusted the rifle slung across his back and checked the loads in his revolver. In weather like this, he would get one chance, maybe 2 if luck favored him. But Elena Rodriguez would not see another dawn. He had been tracking her for 3 days now, following a trail that wound through the most treacherous terrain in the territory. She was running hard and smart, avoiding the main roads and settlements where bounty hunters like Cross would expect to find her. But running smart and running successfully were 2 different things entirely. She had made mistakes, a broken branch here, a footprint in soft earth there. Small signs that most men would miss, but Cross was not most men. The trail led north toward the abandoned mining country, where played-out claims and ghost towns offered shelter for those desperate enough to brave the isolation. It was a rough country, the kind of place where honest folks feared to tread and where desperate people went to disappear. Cross had hunted men through these mountains before, and he knew their moods, their dangers, their secrets. As he climbed higher into the foothills, the wind began to howl through the trees with increasing fury. The temperature was dropping fast, and Cross could feel the storm's bite through his heavy wool coat. He had survived blizzards before, but this one promised to be particularly vicious. Still, he pressed on. Elena Rodriguez was close now. He could sense it the way a predator senses wounded prey. Cross had not always been a killer for hire. Once, a lifetime ago, he had worn a badge and believed in justice. That was before the war, before he had learned that justice was often just. Another word for whoever held the most power. He had served as a deputy marshal in Kansas for 7 years, earning a reputation for fairness and courage. But the war had changed everything, as wars always did. During those bloody years of conflict, Cross had done things that no man should have to do. He had killed boys who looked like his younger brother. He had burned farms that reminded him of his childhood home. He had followed orders that made him question whether there was any difference between soldiers and murderers. When the war ended, he had tried to return to his badge, but the weight of what he had done made it impossible to believe in law and order any more dots, so he had chosen a different path. If the world was going to be filled with violence anyway, at least he could profit from it. Better to be the wolf than the sheep, he had told himself. Better to choose your targets than to have them chosen for you by politicians and generals who had never felt blood on their hands. The bounty hunting had started small. Horse thieves and cattle rustlers who had crossed the wrong ranchers. But as his reputation grew, so did the severity of his contracts. Bank robbers, murderers, army deserters. Cross had tracked them all with the same cold efficiency. He told himself that these people had made their choices, just as he had made his. The frontier was a hard place that demanded hard men to keep it civilized. But Elena Rodriguez was different. This was the first time he had been hired to kill a woman, and despite his carefully constructed emotional armor, something about the contract troubled him. Judge Blackwood's letter had been strangely vague about the specific crime she had committed. Theft, yes, but what kind of theft warranted execution? Fleeing from a marriage ceremony was hardly a capital offense, even in the strictest interpretation of territorial law. Cross pushed these doubts aside, as he had learned to do with all inconvenient thoughts. Doubt was a luxury that men in his profession could not afford. Elena Rodriguez had crossed powerful people, and powerful people paid well for permanent solutions to their problems. That was all he needed to know. The snow was falling harder now, transforming the landscape into a white maze of identical trees and hidden dangers. Cross pulled his hat lower over his eyes and continued climbing, following boot prints that were rapidly being obscured by the storm. She was moving erratically now, probably panicked by the approaching blizzard. Good. Panicked prey made mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. He found her first real error about a mile further up the mountain. Elena Rodriguez had tried to cross a frozen stream, but the ice had given way beneath her weight. The hole in the ice was already beginning to freeze over again, but Cross could see where she had pulled herself out on the far side. Her clothes would be soaked now, and in this weather, that was as good as a death sentence. The cold would finish her long before he had a chance to. Cross studied the scene carefully, reading the story written in disturbed snow and broken ice. She had fallen hard, probably injuring herself in the process. There were drops of blood on the snow, not much, but enough to confirm that she was hurt. She had pulled herself up the far bank and continued north, but her tracks showed an unsteady gait. She was slowing down, growing weaker with each step. Part of Cross, a part he thought he had killed years ago, felt something that might have been pity. Elena Rodriguez was 22 years old, alone in the wilderness, injured and freezing. Whatever she had done, death by exposure was a cruel fate for anyone. But Cross had learned long ago that pity was another luxury he could not afford. The frontier did not reward weakness, and sentiment was the weakest emotion of all. He crossed the stream at a narrow point where the ice looked solid and continued following her trail. The snow was falling so heavily now that he could barely see 20 feet ahead. Soon, the storm would erase all traces of her passage, but by then it would not matter. She could not survive much longer in these conditions. Cross found the abandoned mine shaft just as the last light faded from the sky. The entrance was partially hidden by a fallen tree, but Elena Rodriguez's tracks led directly to it. She had gone to ground like a wounded animal, seeking shelter from the storm that now raged with full fury across the mountains. He approached the mine carefully, his rifle ready. Desperate people did desperate things, and a cornered woman with nothing left to lose might still have a fight left in her. But as he drew closer to the entrance, Cross heard something that stopped him cold. It was not the sound of a desperate fugitive preparing for a final stand. It was not the whisper of steel being drawn or the click of a hammer being cocked. Instead, drifting from the darkness of the mine shaft on the howling wind, Cross heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was the sound of a woman crying, not the defiant sobs of someone facing capture, but the raw, primal cries of someone in agony. The kind of cries that spoke of pain beyond anything that bullets or blades could inflict. The kind of cries that Cross had heard only once before, years ago, in a farmhouse in Kansas where he had helped deliver his sister's first child. Elena Rodriguez was not preparing to fight. She was not plotting an escape or counting her remaining ammunition. She was giving birth, alone in the frozen darkness of an abandoned mine, with a killer waiting outside and a blizzard raging around them both. Cross lowered his rifle slowly, his mind struggling to process this unexpected development. Nothing in Judge Blackwood's letter had mentioned that Elena Rodriguez was pregnant. Nothing in the clinical description of her crimes had suggested that she was carrying a child. For the first time in 12 years of hunting human prey, Daniel Cross found himself facing a situation that his cold professionalism had not prepared him for. The wind howled through the trees like the voices of all the men he had killed, and in the darkness of the mine shaft, Elena Rodriguez cried out again. This time, her voice was not alone. Faint but unmistakable, Cross heard another sound drifting from the depths of the earth. It was the cry of a newborn child, taking its first breath in a world that had already marked it for death. The first light of dawn broke pale and uncertain through the storm clouds, casting an eerie glow across the snow-covered landscape. Daniel Cross had spent the night in a shallow cave 50 yards from the mine entrance, listening to sounds that had shaken something loose inside him that he thought was dead and buried. The crying had continued through the dark hours, sometimes fading to exhausted whimpers, sometimes rising to urgent gasps that spoke of struggle beyond his understanding. Cross emerged from his shelter as the wind began to die down, though snow still fell in thick, lazy flakes. His body ached from the cold and from sleeping on stone, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. The situation before him defied every protocol he had developed for tracking and eliminating targets. Elena Rodriguez was no longer just a name on a contract or a figure in his rifle scope. She had become something more complicated, something that demanded choices he was not prepared to make. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He approached the mine shaft with careful steps, his boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. The entrance yawned before him like a mouth frozen in a silent scream, dark and forbidding despite the pale morning light. Cross paused at the threshold, listening intently. The sounds from within had changed during the night. The desperate cries had given way to softer murmurs, punctuated occasionally by the thin wailing of an infant. The baby had survived the night. Against all odds, in conditions that would have killed a grown man, new life had entered the world. In the belly of an abandoned mine, Cross found himself thinking of his sister Mary, dead now these 8 years, and how she had labored for 18 hours to bring her son into the world. She had been surrounded by women who knew their business, warmed by a proper fire, comforted by her husband's presence. Elena Rodriguez had faced the ordeal alone, with only darkness and stone for company. Cross reached into his coat and withdrew the letter from Judge Blackwood. Reading it once more in the growing light, the clinical language seemed even more insufficient, now failing utterly to capture the complexity of what he had discovered. Stolen family heirlooms valued at over $2,000. What kind of heirlooms? Wedding jewelry that had been forced upon her? Silverware from a house where she had been treated as property rather than family? Fled from lawful marriage ceremony to Senator William Garrett. Cross knew Garrett by reputation. A man in his 60s who had buried 2 wives already and was known for his collection of young brides. The senator's political influence extended across 3 territories, and his personal appetites were the subject of whispered conversations in saloons from Denver to Sacramento. If Elena Rodriguez had run from Garrett's altar, Cross was beginning to understand why. The more he thought about the contract, the more questions arose. Why had Judge Blackwood authorized lethal force for what amounted to breach of contract and petty theft? Why had no mention been made of Elena's pregnancy? Most importantly, why had they chosen to hire an assassin rather than sending federal marshals to bring her back for trial? Cross folded the letter and returned it to his pocket, but his hand remained there, fingers tracing the edge of the paper. In 12 years of bounty hunting, he had developed an instinct for reading between the lines of official documents. This contract stank of cover-up, of powerful men eliminating inconvenient truths before they could see the light of day. A sound from within the mine interrupted his thoughts, a woman's voice, soft and musical despite the exhaustion that colored every word. She was singing a lullaby in Spanish that Cross recognized from his childhood in Texas. His mother had sung the same song to him and his sister during the long, fearful nights when Comanche raids had kept the family huddled in their cabin. Dormit. Niño, dormit ya. Que vino lobo y de Comora. Sleep, child, sleep now, for the wolf is coming and will devour you. The irony was not lost on Cross. He was the wolf in this particular story, sent by powerful men to devour the innocent. But as he listened to Elena Rodriguez sing to her newborn child in a voice made beautiful by love despite everything she had endured, Cross felt something shift inside him. It was not a dramatic transformation, nothing like the sudden conversions described in revival sermons. Instead, it was more like ice beginning to crack under the pressure of spring water. Subtle at first, but inevitably leading to profound change. Cross made his decision. He would enter the mine, not as a hunter stalking prey, but as a man investigating a mystery that was beginning to consume him. He needed to see Elena Rodriguez with his own eyes, to hear her story in her own words, before he could determine what justice actually looked like in this situation. He struck a match and lit the small lantern he carried in his pack, adjusting the flame until it cast a steady golden glow. The mine shaft stretched ahead of him, its walls carved roughly from the living rock by men who had believed they were digging their way to fortune. Most of them had found only backbreaking labor and crushed dreams, but a few had struck veins of silver rich enough to justify the effort. This particular mine had been abandoned for at least 5 years, judging by the rust on the rail tracks and the accumulated debris on the floor. Cross moved deeper into the shaft, following the sound of the lullaby. His footsteps echoed softly in the confined space, but he made no effort to conceal his approach. Elena Rodriguez knew someone was coming. She had probably heard him moving around outside all night. Better to announce his presence than to startle a new mother who might still have access to weapons. The main shaft branched into several smaller tunnels, and Cross paused at each intersection to listen for the direction of the singing. The sound led him deeper into the mountain, past rusted mining equipment and piles of worthless rock that had been discarded by long-dead prospectors. The air grew warmer as he descended, heated by the earth's own blood, and Cross began to understand why. Elena had chosen this place for shelter. In the deepest part of the mine, she might actually survive a Montana winter night. He found her in what had once been the main excavation chamber, a wide space where miners had followed a particularly rich vein of ore. Someone had built a small fire against the far wall, using pieces of broken timber and what looked like pages torn from a book. The smoke rose toward a natural chimney in the rock ceiling, carrying away the worst of the fumes, but leaving enough warmth to make the space almost comfortable. Elena Rodriguez sat propped against a pile of old grain sacks, her newborn child cradled against her chest beneath a heavy wool cloak that Cross recognized as expensive craftsmanship. Even in the lamplight, he could see that she was beautiful in the way that Spanish women often were. Dark hair that caught the light like silk, skin the color of honey, eyes like deep wells that held secrets. But it was not her beauty that stopped Cross in his tracks. It was the way she looked at him when she realized he was there. She showed no fear. Despite being trapped in a mine with a man who was obviously armed and dangerous, despite having just given birth alone in conditions that would have broken stronger people, Elena Rodriguez met Cross's gaze with steady dignity. She continued singing for a moment, finishing the verse of the lullaby before acknowledging his presence. "You must be the man they sent to kill me," she said in accented English, her voice carrying only mild curiosity, as if she were commenting on the weather. Cross lowered his lantern and removed his hat, a gesture of respect that surprised them both. "Yes, ma'am, I am. And will you kill me, I mean?" Elena shifted the baby slightly, and Cross caught a glimpse of tiny fingers and a face red with new life. "I should tell you that I am unarmed. I threw my pistol in the creek yesterday when I realized I might fall through the ice. I could not risk my baby being born next to a loaded weapon." The casual way she spoke of her own potential execution unnerved Cross more than any threat or plea might have. This was not a woman who begged for mercy or tried to bargain for her life. She had already accepted death as a possibility and had made peace with it, in the way that only mothers protecting their children could. "That depends," Cross said carefully, "on what really happened in Silver Ridge. The judge's letter says you stole from Senator Garrett and fled from a lawful marriage. But I'm beginning to think there's more to the story." Elena laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "A lawful marriage? Yes, I suppose it was lawful in the way that selling cattle is lawful, provided the proper papers are signed." She looked down at her child, whose eyes were now open and staring up at her with the unfocused gaze of the newly born. "My father owed Senator Garrett money, gambling debts that he could never repay, so he repaid them with me instead." Cross felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How much money?" $1,200, plus interest, of course." Elena's voice remained steady, but Cross could see the pain behind her calm facade. Senator Garrett was very generous. He agreed to forgive the entire debt in exchange for a wife who could give him children and host his political gatherings. "I was 21 years old and had been trained in music and languages, perfect qualifications for the position. And the theft, the family heirlooms are worth $2,000? Elena reached into her cloak and withdrew a small velvet pouch, which she tossed onto the ground between them. "My mother's jewelry. Earrings and a necklace that belonged to her grandmother before her. They have been in my family for 4 generations. The pouch landed with a soft clink of metal on stone. Senator Garrett claimed them as part of my dowry, but they were never his to take. When I left, I took back what was mine." Cross picked up the pouch and examined its contents in the lamplight. The jewelry was indeed valuable, gold and silver work of the finest Spanish craftsmanship, set with stones that caught the light like captured fire. But these were not the gaudy display pieces favored by American society women. They were family treasures, the kind passed down through generations of mothers to daughters, carrying with them the weight of history and love. "Judge Blackwood's letter says you're armed and dangerous," Cross said, returning the jewelry to its pouch. "I suppose any woman who refuses to be property is dangerous to men like Garrett and Blackwood." Elena adjusted her position, wincing slightly from pain that was still fresh. "Tell me, Mr. Cross, Daniel Cross. Tell me, Mr. Cross, do you have sisters, a mother, women in your life that you care about?" Cross thought of Mary, dead from fever while he was away hunting a cattle rustler, who had probably deserved killing less than the men who had hired Cross to do it. "I had a sister once. Then you understand. Would you have allowed her to be sold to pay your father's debts? Would you have stood by while she was forced to marry a man old enough to be her grandfather, knowing that he had already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the small fire. Cross found himself thinking of Mary at 21, bright and laughing and full of plans for the future. The idea of her being traded like livestock to settle a gambling debt made his hands clenched into fists. "Senator Garrett's previous wives," Cross said. "What happened to them?" "The first died in childbirth, though the midwife whispered that her bruises were not from labor. The second lasted 3 years before she took a fall down the stairs. Very tragic, according to the newspaper. Very convenient, according to the kitchen staff who had seen Garrett's temper firsthand." Alina's voice grew harder. "I was to be wife number 3. I decided I preferred to be a live fugitive instead of a dead wife." Cross stared into the fire, his mind working through the implications of what he was hearing. If Elena was telling the truth, and her calm, matter-of-fact delivery suggested that she was, then Judge Blackwood's letter was not a legitimate legal document, but a murder contract designed to silence an inconvenient witness to corruption and abuse. "The baby," Cross said. "Is it Garrett's?" Elena's face went hard as stone. "No, thank God, no." She looked down at the child in her arms, and her expression softened again. "There was a young man in Silver Ridge, a schoolteacher named Miguel Santos. We were close. When my father arranged the marriage to Garrett, Miguel wanted to run away together, but I told him it would mean his death. Men like Garrett do not forget insults. But you got pregnant anyway." "I was already pregnant when my father made his bargain with the devil. I think he knew, or at least suspected, which is why he was so eager to conclude the arrangement quickly." Elena's eyes flashed with old anger. "Garrett was told that I was a virgin bride. He would have discovered the truth on our wedding night, and then both Miguel and I would have died. So I ran." Cross absorbed this information, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Elena Rodriguez was not a criminal fleeing justice. She was a pregnant woman who had escaped from what amounted to sexual slavery, taking with her only the jewelry that had belonged to her family for generations. The men who wanted her dead were not guardians of law and order, but predators protecting their own interests. The baby began to fuss, making small mewling sounds that tugged at something deep in Cross's chest. Elena opened her cloak and began to nurse the child, performing the most natural act in the world with complete unself-consciousness despite the presence of a stranger. There was something almost sacred about the scene, mother and child illuminated by firelight in the depths of the earth, surrounded by the evidence of other men's failed dreams. "What will you do now?" Elena asked, not looking up from her baby. "Will you complete your contract and collect your $1,000? Or will you let a mother and child disappear into the wilderness?" Cross realized that this was the moment when everything would be decided. He could draw his weapon, end Elena's life with a single shot, and return to Silver Ridge with proof of her death. Judge Blackwood would pay him as promised, and Daniel Cross would continue his career as a man who solved problems for people with money and power. It would be the easy choice, the profitable choice, the choice that required no change in the carefully constructed walls he had built around his conscience, or he could choose to see Elena Rodriguez not as a target, but as a human being deserving of protection. He could choose to believe that some things were more important than money, that some people deserved to live regardless of what powerful men wanted. It would be the difficult choice, The dangerous choice. The choice that would transform him. From hunter to protector. Cross made his decision. He reached into his coat and withdrew his pistol. And for a moment, Elena's composure finally cracked. She pulled her baby closer to her chest and closed her eyes, waiting for the shot that would end her story. Instead, Cross removed the bullets from the cylinder and scattered them across the floor of the mine. "My name is Daniel Cross," he said. "Formally, and I am no longer hunting you, Elena Rodriguez. If you'll have my help, I'd like to get you and your child somewhere safe." Elena opened her eyes, and for the first time since he had found her, Cross saw tears on her cheeks. But she was smiling too, and the combination of joy and relief transformed her face into something radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will. Have your help." Outside the mine, the storm was beginning to break, and pale sunlight filtered down through the remaining clouds. But inside the mountain, by the light of a small fire built from the debris of other men's dreams, Daniel Cross felt something long frozen beginning to thaw in his chest. The hunt was over. The protection had begun. The morning light revealed a world transformed by the storm's fury. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the mountainside, creating a pristine wilderness that bore no trace of human passage. Daniel Cross stood at the entrance to the mine shaft, studying the landscape with the calculating eye of a man whose survival had always depended on reading the subtle language of weather and terrain. The blizzard had been both curse and blessing. While it had nearly killed Elena Rodriguez during her labor, it had also erased any trail that pursuing lawmen might follow. Inside the mine, Elena sat quietly nursing her child while Cross prepared a more substantial fire. He had ventured out before dawn to gather dry wood from the sheltered side of fallen trees, and now flames crackled cheerfully against the stone wall, casting dancing shadows across the excavation chamber. The baby, a girl Elena had told him, seemed healthy despite her dramatic entrance into the world, though Cross knew that appearances could be deceiving when it came to newborns. "She needs a name," Elena said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I cannot keep calling her mi niña forever." Cross added another piece of wood to the fire and settled back against the mine wall. "What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking Esperanza. It means hope in Spanish." Elena looked down at the infant's face, which was visible now in the improved light. The baby had her mother's dark hair and what appeared to be her delicate bone structure, but her eyes were still the cloudy blue of all newborns. "She was born in darkness, but she represents the possibility of light. Esperanza seems appropriate." "Esperanza." "Rodriguez," Cross said, testing the sound of it. "It's a fine name." Elena glanced at him sharply. "Not Rodriguez, Santos, Esperanza Santos." Her voice carried a quiet defiance that made Cross realize he had missed something important. "Santos, after her father?" "Miguel Santos was a good man. A teacher who believed that education could lift people out of poverty and ignorance. He wanted to marry me properly, with ceremony and celebration. But my father—" Elena's voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "Miguel does not even know about Esperanza. I left Silver Ridge before I began to show, and I have had no way to contact him. For all he knows, I married Senator Garrett, and am living as a senator's wife." Cross studied Elena's face in the firelight. Despite everything she had endured, forced marriage, pregnancy, flight through the wilderness, childbirth in a mine shaft, she spoke of Miguel Santos with a softness that suggested love still lived in her heart. It was one more complexity, in a situation that was already more tangled than any bounty contract Cross had ever encountered. "Tell me about him," Cross said. "Miguel Santos." Elena's expression brightened for the first time since he had found her. "He came to Silver Ridge 2 years ago to teach at the new school. He had studied at a university in California, but he wanted to help children in small towns learn to read and write. Most of the local men thought he was foolish. Why waste time on education when there was money to be made in mining and cattle? She paused to adjust Esperanza's position, then continued. But Miguel believed that knowledge was the only thing that could break the cycle of poverty and violence that trapped so many families. Cross found himself genuinely curious about this schoolteacher who had managed to win Elena's heart. How did you meet him? My father hired me out as a translator and guide for visiting businessmen. Silver Ridge has many Mexican families, and few of the American merchants spoke Spanish. Miguel needed someone to help him communicate with the parents of his Mexican students, so he asked my father to arrange for my services. Elena smiled at the memory. I expected to spend an afternoon helping a stuffy academic write letters to parents about their children's progress. Instead, I found a young man who was building desks with his own hands, because the school board said there was no money for proper furniture. The picture Elena painted was of a man driven by idealism rather than profit, a rare breed on the frontier, where survival often demanded compromise with harsh realities. Cross had met few such men in his travels, and most of them had not. Lived long, the West was not kind to dreamers. He sounds like someone who would have tried to protect you, Cross observed. When your father arranged the marriage to Garrett, why didn't you turn to Miguel for help? Elena's face darkened. Because I knew what would happen. Miguel would have confronted my father, demanded the right to marry me himself. My father would have laughed and told him that a schoolteacher's salary could never pay gambling debts. Miguel would have insisted anyway, probably challenged Garrett to defend my honor. And then Miguel would have died. She looked directly at Cross. Men like Senator Garrett do not fight fair. They do not meet their enemies in the street at noon with pistols. They hire men like he used to be. The observation stung because it was accurate. Cross had indeed worked for men like Garrett, accepting contracts without asking too many questions about motivation or justice. He had told himself that he was simply a tool, no more responsible for the morality of his actions than a knife was. Responsible for the hand that wielded it. But sitting in the mine with Elena and her newborn daughter, Cross began to understand that moral neutrality was itself a form of complicity. You protected him by running away, Cross said. I tried to. But now, Elena gestured around the mine shaft, encompassing their current predicament. Now I have placed him in danger anyway. When Senator Garrett discovers that I was pregnant when I fled, he will assume the child is his. But when he realizes the timing is wrong, he will start asking questions. It will not take him long to connect Miguel to my disappearance. Cross felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Garrett will go after Santos, if he has not already. Miguel is probably dead, and it is my fault for being a coward. I should have stayed and faced whatever Garrett would have done to me. At least then Miguel would have been safe. The weight of guilt in Elena's voice was palpable, and Cross recognized it because he carried similar burdens. How many people had suffered because of choices he had made or failed to make? How many innocents had paid the price for his professional detachment? The questions had haunted him for years, but he had always managed to push them aside by focusing on the next contract, the next target, the next payment. But here in the mine, with a woman who had sacrificed everything to protect the man she loved and the child she carried, Cross could no longer ignore the accumulating weight of his own moral failures. Elena's courage threw his cowardice into sharp relief, forcing him to confront the man he had become and the man he might still choose to be. There's something else, Cross said slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Something I haven't told you about my contract. Elena looked up from Esperanza, sensing the gravity in his tone. What is it? Cross reached into his coat and withdrew Judge Blackwood's letter, but instead of unfolding it, he held it over the flames. The contract specifies that I'm to bring back proof of your death. Not your body for burial, not your personal effects. For your family, proof of death. He paused, watching Elena's face in the firelight. That means they never intend for your body to be found. They want you to disappear completely, as if you never existed. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke. Elena was not just fleeing an unwanted marriage or facing charges for theft. She was marked for complete elimination, her very existence an inconvenience that powerful men wanted erased from history. But why? Elena whispered. What threat could I possibly pose to men like Garrett and Blackwood? Cross fed the letter to the flames, watching Judge Blackwood's official seal blacken and curl. That's what we need to figure out. Because until we do, neither you nor Miguel Santos, nor anyone else connected to this situation, is safe. As the contract burned, Cross felt a strange sense of liberation. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, transforming himself from hunter to hunted. By destroying the letter, he had made himself complicit in Elena's escape, an accessory to whatever crimes the authorities claimed she had committed. Judge Blackwood and Senator Garrett would not forgive such betrayal, especially from a man they had trusted to handle their most sensitive business. There is something else. I should tell you, Elena said quietly. Something I learned on my wedding day, just before I fled. Cross settled back against the mine wall, sensing that whatever Elena was about to reveal would change everything once again. Go on. Senator Garrett was drunk during the pre-ceremony dinner. He was boasting to Judge Blackwood and the other men about his political plans, about how marrying me would help him secure the Mexican vote in the upcoming territorial elections. Elena's voice grew harder as she continued. But then he said something strange. He laughed and told them that once I was his wife, no one would dare question his version of what happened to the previous territorial inspector. Cross felt his blood chill. What territorial inspector? A man named Thomas Hernandez. He came to Silver Ridge 6 months ago to investigate reports of voting irregularities and intimidation of Mexican families during the last election. According to the official story, Inspector Hernandez left town after completing his investigation, filing a report that cleared Garrett and his associates of any wrongdoing. Elena paused, adjusting her hold on Esperanza. But Miguel told me that Hernandez never left Silver Ridge. His horse was found wandering loose 3 days after he supposedly departed for the territorial capital. The pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place in Cross's mind. You think Garrett killed the inspector? I think Garrett had the inspector killed, yes. And I think he was planning to use my family connections to legitimize his position with the Mexican community while simultaneously silencing any potential witnesses to what really happened to Hernandez. Elena met Cross's gaze directly. You see, Inspector Hernandez was my mother's cousin. He stayed with my family during his investigation, and he told my father that he had found evidence of serious crimes. Vote buying, intimidation, possibly. Even murder of political opponents. Cross stared into the fire, his mind racing through the implications. If Elena was right, then her marriage to Garrett had been about much more than settling her father's gambling debts. It had been a calculated political move designed to neutralize a potential threat while providing Garrett with cover for past crimes. The evidence, Cross said. Did Hernandez tell your father where he kept it? He said he had hidden copies of his findings somewhere safe, somewhere that Garrett could never reach. But he died before he could retrieve them or send them to the territorial capital. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I think my father knows where that evidence is hidden. I think that is why Garrett was so insistent on marrying me immediately, before I could learn family secrets that might destroy him. Cross felt the weight of revelation settling over him like a landslide. Elena Rodriguez was not just a runaway bride or a victim of forced marriage. She was potentially the key to exposing corruption that reached from small-town politics to the territorial government itself. No wonder Garrett and Blackwood wanted her dead rather than simply returned. Living, She represented a threat to everything they had built through violence and intimidation. "Your father," Cross said carefully. "Would he have told you about the evidence if you had asked?" Elena laughed bitterly. "My father sold me to pay his gambling debts. Do you think he would have risked Garrett's wrath to share dangerous secrets with his daughter?" She shook her head. "But there is someone else who might know. Someone Hernandez trusted completely. Miguel Santos." Miguel and Inspector Hernandez became friends during his stay in Silver Ridge. They spent many evenings discussing politics and education, talking about ways to improve conditions for Mexican families in the territory. If Hernandez told anyone where he hid his evidence, it would have been Miguel. Cross stood and began pacing the small chamber, his mind working through possibilities and dangers. If Miguel Santos possessed evidence that could destroy Senator Garrett's political career and expose Judge Blackwood's corruption, then the schoolteacher was already a dead man. Garrett would not wait for legal proceedings or territorial investigations. He would handle the threat the same way he had handled Inspector Hernandez, quickly, quietly, and permanently. "We have to get back to Silver Ridge," Cross said. "We have to warn Santos and recover that evidence before Garrett silences him." Elena looked down at Esperanza, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, blissfully unaware of the dangers surrounding her young life. "It is too late. By now Miguel is probably dead, and any evidence he might have hidden is destroyed. Garrett is not a man who leaves loose ends." "Maybe, but we have to try." Cross knelt beside Elena, his voice urgent with conviction. "You said Miguel Santos believes in education, in the power of knowledge to change things. Well, the evidence." Hernandez gathered his knowledge that could bring down Garrett and everyone like him. "If Santos is still alive, if he still has access to that information, then we have a chance to make sure your sacrifice means something." Elena studied Cross's face in the firelight, searching for something she could trust. Finally she nodded. Slowly, "If we do this, there is no going back. Garrett will never stop hunting us. Judge Blackwood will put a price on our heads that will bring every bounty hunter in 3 territories after us." Cross thought of the burning letter, of the bullets scattered across the mine floor, of the choice he had made to protect rather than kill. "I stopped going back the moment I decided not to pull that trigger. Now the only direction left is forward." Outside the mine, the wind was beginning to pick up again, promising another storm before the day was through. But inside the chamber, by the light of their small fire, Daniel Cross and Elena Rodriguez began planning not just their survival, but their fight back against the forces that had marked them both for death. The hunter had become the protector. Soon, the protector would become something even more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. ESPERNZA. Santos stirred in her mother's arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to look directly at Cross. For a moment, he imagined he saw something in that infant gaze, not accusation or fear, but hope. Hope that the world she had been born into might be changed by the choices brave people were willing to make. Cross smiled at the baby, and for the first time in 12 years, he felt like a man worthy of a child's trust. Dawn brought clarity to the mountain air and purpose to Daniel Cross's movements. He had spent the pre-dawn hours creating a makeshift sledge from mining equipment and salvaged timber, lashing together a transport that could carry Elena and baby Esperanza down the treacherous mountain trails. The contraption was crude but functional, a testament to the practical skills that had kept him alive through 12 years of tracking dangerous men across hostile terrain. Elena watched him work with quiet intensity, nursing Esperanza while studying every knot and joint in Cross's construction. She had said little since their conversation about the hidden evidence, but Cross could see the calculations running behind her dark eyes. She was measuring distances, assessing risks, preparing herself for a journey that could easily kill them. All if they made even small mistakes. "How long since you've eaten a proper meal?" Cross asked, testing the rope bindings one final time. 3 days, maybe 4. I had some dried meat and hardtack, but I finished it yesterday morning. Elena's voice carried no complaint, only matter-of-fact acceptance of hardship. I was more concerned with staying ahead of whoever was following me than with proper nutrition. Cross reached into his pack and withdrew a package wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside were strips of jerked beef, dried apples, and a small loaf of bread that had gone somewhat stale, but was still edible. He had been rationing his supplies carefully during the hunt, but those calculations no longer mattered. Elena needed strength for what lay ahead, and the baby needed her mother healthy. Eat, he said, settling the package beside her. All of it. We have a long journey ahead, and I can hunt for fresh meat once we reach lower elevations. Elena accepted the food with a gratitude that made Cross uncomfortable. He was not accustomed to being thanked for basic human decency, and her appreciation reminded him of how far he had drifted from the kind of man who deserved such thanks. But as he watched Elena eat with the focused intensity of someone who had been truly hungry, Cross felt something shifting in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the simple act of providing care to someone who needed it. Tell me about the route back to Silver Ridge, Elena said between bites of bread. I know the main roads, but if Garrett has men watching for us ... we won't be taking the main roads. Cross unfolded a hand-drawn map from his coat, spreading it on the ground between them. This shows the old mining trails that connected the abandoned claims to the original settlements. Most of them haven't been used in years, but they're still passable if you know where to look. Elena studied the map, tracing potential routes with her finger. This trail here, it passes very close to the Ramirez homestead. Mrs. Ramirez helped deliver 3 of my cousin's babies. She would know how to care for Esperanza if ... If what? Cross asked, though he already suspected what Elena was thinking. If something happens to me. If we encounter Garrett's men and I don't survive. Elena's voice remained steady, but Cross could see the fear she was working to control. Esperanza needs someone who can care for her properly. Mrs. Ramirez has 6 children of her own, and her husband is an honest man who would not turn away an orphaned child. Cross felt anger building in his chest, not at Elena, but at a world that forced new mothers to plan for their children's survival in case of their own death. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said firmly. We're going to get to Silver Ridge, find Miguel Santos, recover the evidence, and expose what Garrett has done, all 3 of us. Elena met his gaze directly. You cannot promise that, Mr. Cross. You know better than anyone how dangerous men like Garrett can be. I appreciate your protection, but I will not risk my daughter's life on optimism. The conversation was interrupted by Esperanza's crying, a thin, hungry sound that filled the mind chamber with urgency. Elena adjusted her position and began nursing the baby again, but Cross could see exhaustion in every line of her body. She had given birth less than 24 hours ago, had spent the night in a mine shaft, and was now being asked to travel 20 miles through hostile terrain. Even with the sledge, the journey would test her endurance to its limits. There's another option, Cross said slowly. I could take you to the Ramirez homestead and leave you there while I go to Silver Ridge alone. If Santos is still alive, if the evidence still exists, I might be able to recover it without putting you and Esperanza in danger. Elena shook her head before he finished speaking. Miguel will not trust you. He has never seen you before, and if Garrett's men have been asking questions about me, Miguel will assume that any stranger is a threat. You need me to convince him that you are trying to help. Cross recognized the truth in her words, but that did not make the situation any easier to accept. Taking Elena and a newborn baby into what was essentially a war zone violated every principle of tactical planning he had ever learned. But leaving them behind felt like abandonment, And Cross was discovering that he was no longer capable of walking away from people who needed his protection. "All right," he said finally. "We do this together. But we do it my way, following my route, stopping when I say stop. You're not just Elena Rodriguez anymore. You're a target that men will kill to reach. That means you follow orders without question. Understood?" Elena smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of humor Cross had seen from her. "I have been following men's orders my entire life, Mr. Cross. The difference is that for the first time, I believe the man giving them actually cares whether I live or die." The observation hit Cross harder than he expected. How long had it been since anyone had trusted him with something precious? How long since he had accepted responsibility for someone else's welfare without the promise of payment? The weight of Elena's faith in him was both terrifying and exhilarating, demanding that he become worthy of the trust she had placed in him. Cross began preparing for their departure with methodical efficiency. He secured his rifle and ammunition, distributed the remaining supplies between his pack and the sledge, and extinguished their fire with careful attention to eliminating all traces of smoke. Elena wrapped Esperanza in layers of cloth and blankets, creating a cocoon that would protect the baby from wind and cold during the journey. "One more thing," Cross said as they prepared to leave the mine. He reached into his coat and withdrew his spare pistol, a smaller weapon than his primary sidearm, but reliable and accurate at close range. "Do you know how to use this?" Elena examined the weapon with practiced familiarity. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. He said a woman alone on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself." She checked the cylinder and tested the action with movements that spoke of genuine competence. "I am not an expert, but I can hit what I aim at." Cross nodded and handed her a box of ammunition. "Keep it loaded, keep it close, and if we run into trouble, use it. Don't hesitate, don't warn anyone, just shoot. Men like Garrett's hired guns don't deserve the courtesy of fair play." They emerged from the mine into a world transformed by fresh snow and brilliant sunshine. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind air so clear and cold that it seemed to ring like crystal when Cross breathed it in. The sledge moved smoothly over the snow-covered ground, though Cross could feel the strain in his shoulders as he pulled the makeshift transport down the steep mountain slopes. Elena walked beside the sledge, one hand resting on the rope rails for balance, the other holding Esperanza close to her chest. Despite her exhaustion, she kept pace with Cross's steady rhythm, never complaining about the cold or the difficulty of the terrain. Cross found himself impressed by her resilience. Most people would have collapsed under the physical and emotional stress she had endured. But Elena seemed to draw strength from the very act of moving toward their goal. They made good time through the morning, following deer trails and abandoned mining roads that wound down through stands of pine and aspen. Cross stopped every hour to check their back trail and scan the surrounding ridges for signs of pursuit, but the wilderness remained empty and peaceful. Either Garrett's men had not yet discovered Elena's trail, or they were waiting for better conditions before beginning their search. As they descended toward lower elevations, the snow became patchy and the traveling easier. Cross was able to increase their pace, though he remained careful not to push Elena beyond her limits. She had developed a slight limp, probably from her fall through the ice 2 days earlier, but she showed no signs of wanting to rest. "Tell me about your life before this," Elena said during one of their brief stops. "Before you became a bounty hunter, what did you do?" Cross checked the sledge bindings and scanned the trail ahead before answering. "I was a deputy marshal in Kansas for 7 years. Before that, I was a soldier during the war. Before that, I was just a farm boy who thought he understood how the world worked." "What changed your mind?" "About how the world worked, I mean." Cross considered the question while he redistributed the weight on the sledge. "I saw too many good men die for bad reasons. I saw too many bad men prosper while good men suffered. After a while, I stopped believing that justice and law were the same thing. Elena adjusted Esperanza's blankets and checked the baby's breathing before responding. My mother used to say that justice and law were like two rivers that sometimes flowed in the same direction and sometimes did not. She said the trick was learning to tell the difference. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She died when I was 16, and my father ... changed after that. He started drinking more, gambling more, making decisions that she never would have allowed. Elena's voice carried old pain. I think if she had lived, none of this would have happened. She would not have let him sell me to pay his debts. Cross felt a surge of anger at Lena's father, a man he had never met, but already despised for his weakness and selfishness. How could any father trade his daughter's freedom and safety for the temporary relief of gambling debts? How could any man look at someone like Elena and see property rather than a human being deserving of love and protection? Some people, Cross said carefully, are not worthy of the families they are given. Elena nodded slowly. I used to think that family loyalty required me to forgive anything, to excuse any behavior because blood was thicker than water. But carrying Esperanza changed my perspective. Now I understand that protecting your child is more important than honoring your father. They resumed walking, the sledge cutting a smooth track through the remaining patches of snow. Cross found himself thinking about family, the sister he had lost, the parents who had died while he was away at war, the connections he had severed. In his transformation from idealistic young deputy to cynical bounty hunter, Elena's love for her daughter was obvious in every gesture, every glance, every adjustment of the baby's blankets. It was the kind of pure, protective devotion that Cross had forgotten existed in the world. When we reach Silver Ridge, Elena said suddenly, when we find Miguel and recover the evidence, what happens then? Garrett is a territorial senator with connections to judges and federal marshals. Even with proof of his crimes, who will have the authority to arrest him? Cross had been wondering the same thing. Exposing corruption was only the first step. Finding someone trustworthy enough and powerful enough to act on that evidence would be equally challenging. There's a federal circuit judge named Harrison Webb who has a reputation for honesty. He's based in Denver, but he travels through this territory twice a year hearing cases. If we can get the evidence to him, if we can survive long enough to get the evidence to him, Elena corrected. Garrett will not wait for legal proceedings. He will try to kill us all before we can testify against him. Cross could not argue with her logic. Men like Garrett had not reached their positions of power by allowing enemies to survive long enough to destroy them. The moment they recovered Inspector Hernandez's evidence, they would become targets for elimination rather than capture. Then, we'll have to be smarter and faster than his hired guns, Cross said. We'll have to become the hunters instead of the hunted. Elena was quiet for a long moment, walking steadily beside the sledge while Esperanza slept peacefully in her arms. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that had not been there before. Miguel Santos is a good man, she said. If he has survived this long, if he still has access to Hernandez's evidence, then he deserves the chance to see justice done. And Esperanza deserves to grow up in a world where men like Garrett cannot destroy families without consequences. Cross felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival or even revenge. For the first time since leaving the army, he was fighting for something larger than himself, something that mattered more than money or reputation, or the simple pleasure of winning a dangerous game. Yes, he said simply, they do. As the sun reached its zenith, they crested a ridge that offered their first clear view of the valley containing Silver Ridge. The town looked peaceful from this distance, its buildings arranged along the main street like toys in a child's playroom. Smoke rose from chimneys, horses moved slowly along the roads, and life appeared to continue with normal rhythms. But Cross knew that appearances could be deceiving. Somewhere in that peaceful-looking town, Miguel Santos was either hiding in fear or already dead. Somewhere in those ordinary buildings lay evidence that could topple a corrupt political machine or disappear forever if they failed in their mission. Cross checked his weapons one final time and helped Elena adjust Esperanza's wrappings for the final descent. They were no longer refugees fleeing into the wilderness. They were a small army of 3, marching toward a battle that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of justice in the entire territory. The commitment had been made. The first act of grace had been completed. Now came the test of whether love and courage could triumph over power and corruption. Daniel Cross looked down at the town where his old life would finally end and his new life would truly begin. Whatever happened next, he would face it not as a solitary hunter, but as a protector, a father figure, and a man who had remembered what it meant to fight for something worth dying for. The Ramirez homestead sat in a protected valley 3 miles outside Silver Ridge, surrounded by fields that would bloom with corn and beans come spring, but now lay dormant under a thin blanket of snow. Smoke rose from the chimney of the modest adobe house, and Cross could see children playing in the yard despite the cold. It was exactly the kind of peaceful family scene that made him acutely aware of the danger they were bringing to innocent people. Maria Ramirez opened her door before they reached the porch, her weathered face breaking into a smile of recognition when she saw Elena, but the smile faltered when she noticed the baby in Elena's arms and the grim expression on the stranger's face beside her. "Elena, Mia, what has happened?" Maria's voice carried the maternal authority of a woman who had raised 6 children and helped deliver dozens more. "And who is this man?" Elena stepped forward, exhaustion finally showing in her movements. "Mrs. Ramirez, this is Daniel Cross. He has been helping me. And this," she pulled back the blanket to reveal Esperanza's sleeping face, "is my daughter." Maria's eyes widened as she took in the implications. A baby that had not existed when Elena fled from her wedding, a dangerous-looking man with guns, and Elena herself obviously weak from recent childbirth. Without another word, Maria stepped aside and gestured them into the warmth of her home. The interior of the Ramirez house was simple but welcoming, filled with the sounds and smells of family life. 3 young children peered curiously from behind their mother's skirts while 2 older boys continued their studies at a rough wooden table. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 4, approached Elena with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Is that a real baby?" she asked in Spanish, standing on tiptoe to get a better look at Esperanza. "Yes, little one," Elena replied in the same language. "Her name is Esperanza, and she was born 3 days ago." Cross watched the interaction with fascination. Elena's entire demeanor changed when she spoke to the child. The wariness and calculation that had become second nature during her flight were replaced by warmth and natural affection. For a moment, he could see the woman she had been before. Circumstance had forced her to become a fugitive. Maria bustled around the small kitchen, preparing food and hot coffee with the efficiency born of long practice. She asked no questions about their circumstances, but Cross could see her making mental notes about Elena's condition, the quality of their clothing, and the weight of the weapons he carried. This was a woman who understood that some stories were better learned gradually than demanded immediately. "You will stay for dinner," Maria announced in accented English, including Cross in her invitation, despite obvious uncertainty about his role in Elena's story. "And Elena, you will rest. A new mother should not be traveling so soon after birth." Elena settled into a chair near the fire, cradling Esperanza while accepting a bowl of beef stew that smelled like heaven after days of cold rations. Cross remained, standing near the door, his eyes constantly scanning the windows and checking the approaches to the house. He had developed an instinct for danger over the years, and that instinct was screaming warnings about their exposed position. "Mr. Cross," Maria said, offering him coffee in a tin cup. "Elena says you have been helping her. Are you family?" The question was loaded with meaning. In Maria's world, unmarried men did not travel alone with young women unless they were relatives or had dishonorable intentions. Cross understood the cultural implications and chose his words carefully. "No, ma'am. I was hired to find Elena, but when I discovered her situation, I chose to help her instead." It was the truth, though greatly simplified. She and her baby need protection from some very dangerous people. Maria's husband, Carlos, entered from the barn where he'd been tending to their animals. He was a compact man with calloused hands and intelligent eyes that took in the scene with practiced assessment. Like his wife, he asked no immediate questions, but Cross could feel himself being evaluated with the careful attention of a man who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "You are welcome in our home," Carlos said formally, extending his hand to Cross. "Any friend of Elena's family is a friend of ours." Cross shook the offered hand, noting the strength of Carlos's grip and the confident way he met Cross's eyes. This was not a man who would be easily intimidated or deceived, which made him potentially valuable as an ally, and definitely dangerous as an enemy. The evening meal was a revelation for Cross. He had forgotten what it felt like to sit at a family table, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of children and the warm conversation of people who genuinely cared for each other. The Ramirez children bombarded Elena with questions about the baby, switching between Spanish and English with the fluid ease of the bilingual. Elena answered with patience and obvious affection, clearly drawing strength from the normalcy of the interaction. "Tell me about Miguel Santos," Cross said to Carlos when the children had been sent to bed and the adults could speak freely. "How well do you know him?" Carlos exchanged a glance with his wife before answering. "Miguel is a good man. He came to our house many times to discuss our children's education, to explain how learning English would give them opportunities we never had." Carlos paused, choosing his words carefully. "But Miguel has not been seen in Silver Ridge for 4 days now. People are asking questions." Elena looked up sharply from where she was nursing Esperanza. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make a man nervous," Maria replied grimly. "Sheriff Davidson came by yesterday, asking if we had seen Miguel or heard anything about his whereabouts. He said Miguel was wanted for questioning about some missing territorial documents." Cross felt his blood chill. Sheriff Davidson was one of the names on Judge Blackwood's list of reliable associates, a man who could be counted on to ask the right questions and ignore the wrong answers. If Davidson was actively searching for Miguel Santos, it meant that Garrett had already moved against the schoolteacher. "Did the sheriff say anything else?" Cross asked. Carlos nodded slowly. "He warned us that Miguel might be dangerous, that he had been seen with men who were suspected of stealing government property. He advised us to report any contact immediately and not to trust anything Miguel might tell us." Cross recognized the strategy. Garrett was not just hunting Miguel Santos. He was poisoning the community against him, ensuring that the schoolteacher would find no allies or assistance if he tried to seek help. It was a sophisticated approach that spoke to Garrett's political experience and his understanding of how to manipulate public opinion. "Miguel is not dangerous," Elena said firmly. "He is one of the most gentle men I have ever known. If Sheriff Davidson is spreading such stories, it means that Miguel has something Garrett wants very badly." "Or had something," Cross said grimly. "We may already be too late." Elena's face went pale, but she did not allow herself to break down. Instead, she carefully adjusted Esperanza's position and met Cross's gaze with determined resolve. "We have to find out. We have to try." Maria had been listening to the conversation with growing concern. "Elena, Mia, what kind of trouble are you involved in? Why would the sheriff be looking for Miguel?" What does any of this have to do with your baby? Elena looked to Cross, silently asking permission to share their story. Cross nodded slightly, recognizing that they would need the Ramirez family's help if they were going to have any chance of success. Maria and Carlos deserved to know what risks they were taking by sheltering fugitives. Over the next hour, Elena told the complete story of her forced marriage, her flight from Silver Ridge, and her discovery of the conspiracy surrounding Inspector Hernandez's death. She spoke calmly and factually, but Cross could see the effort it cost her to relive those traumatic events. Maria's face grew increasingly grim as the tale unfolded, while Carlos's expression shifted from concern to anger, to determination. "Senator Garrett is a pig," Maria said bluntly when Elena finished. "We have always known this, but we had no proof. If Miguel has evidence of crimes, then Miguel is a dead man unless we can reach him first," Cross interrupted. "The question is whether he's still alive and where he might be hiding." Carlos stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness that surrounded their home. "There is a place," he said slowly. "An old line shack up in the timber about 5 miles from town. Miguel mentioned it once when we were discussing places where children could go to be safe if there was ever trouble with raiders or bad men. He said it was well hidden and stocked with supplies." Cross felt a surge of hope. Could he reach it without being seen? If he knew he was in danger, yes. Miguel is not a fighting man, but he is intelligent and careful. If he suspected that Garrett's men were coming for him, he might have gone to ground rather than trying to run. Elena shifted Esperanza to her shoulder and stood with obvious effort. "We have to go there. Tonight." "No," Cross said firmly. "You need rest, and the baby needs warmth and safety." "I'll go alone." Elena's eyes flashed with anger. "Miguel will not trust you. I told you this before. He has never seen you, and if he is hiding from Garrett's men, he will assume that any stranger is a threat." Cross recognized the truth in her words, but the thought of taking Elena and a 3-day-old baby into the wilderness on what might be a futile search violated every protective instinct he had developed. "It's too dangerous. If Garrett's men are watching the area, then we will be careful," Elena interrupted. "But I will not sit safely by a fire while Miguel dies alone in the forest, because he is too afraid to trust someone who could save him." Maria stepped forward, her face set with maternal determination. "Elena will go nowhere tonight. She gave birth 3 days ago at a mine shaft, and she needs proper rest before she can travel again." She turned to Cross. "You can scout the area, find this cabin, and see if Miguel is there. If he is, you can return for Elena in the morning." Cross considered the proposal. It made tactical sense to reconnoiter the area before committing Elena and the baby to another dangerous journey. But it also meant leaving them unprotected at the Ramirez homestead, where Sheriff Davidson or other searchers might find them. "There is another problem," Carlos said quietly. "If Miguel is not at the line shack, if he has already been captured or killed, then Elena and the baby will need to disappear completely. Garrett will never stop hunting them, and eventually he will trace their movements to our door." The implications hung heavy in the warm air of the kitchen. By sheltering Elena and Cross, the Ramirez family had made themselves targets for Garrett's retribution. If their assistance was discovered, they would face the same deadly consequences that had already claimed Inspector Hernandez. "You should not have to risk your family for us," Elena said softly. "We can leave tonight, find somewhere else to hide." "No," Maria said firmly. "You are not leaving my house with a newborn baby in the middle of winter. Besides," she added with a fierce smile, "Carlos and I have been waiting years for someone brave enough to stand up to men like Garrett. If God has finally sent us that opportunity, we will not waste it." Cross felt a surge of respect for this woman who was willing to risk everything for the sake of justice. Maria Ramirez reminded him of his own mother, who had faced down cattle Rustlers and Comanche raiders with the same calm determination. Such women were the backbone of frontier communities, the moral force that made civilization possible in wild places. "All right," Cross said finally. "I'll scout the line shack tonight and return before dawn. If Miguel is there, we'll figure out how to approach him safely. If he's not..." Cross left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood the implications. Carlos provided detailed directions to the line shack, sketching a rough map that showed landmarks and potential approach routes. The cabin was located in heavy timber that would provide concealment, but also offered multiple hiding places for potential ambushes. Cross studied the map carefully, memorizing every detail that might mean the difference between success and failure. As he prepared to leave, Elena called him aside. "Mr. Cross, Daniel, if something happens to you out there, if you don't come back, I want you to know that you have already done more for me and Esperanza than anyone had a right to expect. You gave us our lives when you could have taken them." Cross looked down at Elena, this remarkable woman who had faced every challenge with courage and dignity despite having every reason to despair. "I'm coming back," he said simply. "That's a promise." Elena smiled, and for the first time since he had found her in the mine, Cross saw hope in her expression. "I believe you." As Cross rode into the darkness, following trails that wound through timber thick enough to hide an army, he carried with him something he had not possessed in years, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Elena and Esperanza were no longer just people he was protecting. They had become his family, chosen rather than born, but no less real for that choice. The stakes had never been higher, and the dangers had never been greater. But Daniel Cross had finally found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for if necessary. Whatever waited in the darkness ahead, he would face it not as a solitary hunter, but as a man with people depending on him, trusting him, believing in him. The line shack waited somewhere in the Black Forest, and with it, perhaps the key to bringing down a corrupt empire. But even if Miguel Santos was already dead, even if the evidence had been destroyed, Cross knew that he would continue fighting. Elena Rodriguez and her daughter had shown him that some things were more important than survival, more valuable than money, more sacred than the law itself. They had shown him what it meant to be a man worthy of trust, worthy of love, worthy of the faith that innocent people placed in those strong enough to protect them. Whatever happened next, Daniel Cross would not betray that trust. The hunter had become a protector. The protector had become a guardian. Soon, the guardian would become something even more dangerous, a man with a family to protect and nothing left to lose. The line shack materialized from the darkness like a ghost made solid, its weathered walls barely visible against the towering pines that surrounded it. Daniel Cross had been moving through the forest for 3 hours, following game trails and creek beds to avoid the main paths where Garrett's men might be waiting. The cabin showed no lights, no smoke from its chimney, no signs of human habitation. But Cross's instincts told him that someone was inside, watching, waiting. He circled the structure twice before approaching, noting the placement of windows, the condition of the door, the small corral that could shelter a horse if needed. Everything about the shack suggested it had been abandoned for months, but Cross caught subtle signs that told a different story: boot prints in sheltered snow, a water bucket that was too clean to have sat empty all winter, and most tellingly, a thin wire stretched across the approach path at ankle height. Miguel Santos was alive, alert, and prepared for trouble. Cross found a position 30 yards from the cabin and settled down to wait. Rushing the approach would likely get him shot by a frightened schoolteacher, and he needed Miguel alive and cooperative if they were going to recover Inspector Hernandez's evidence. Better to be patient, to let the man inside grow curious about the stranger who had found his hiding place but made no aggressive moves. The waiting stretched into an hour, then 2. Cross remained motionless despite the cold that crept through his coat and the tension that knotted his shoulders. He had learned patience during the war, sitting in trenches and rifle pits while enemy forces moved in the distance. This was different. Instead of waiting to kill, he was waiting to save, but the discipline remained the same. Finally, the cabin door opened just wide enough for a rifle barrel to emerge, followed by a man's voice speaking careful English with a Spanish accent. "I know you are out there. I have been watching you for an hour. State your business or leave my property." Cross remained in his concealed position, but raised his voice enough to be heard clearly. "My name is Daniel Cross. I'm here about Elena Rodriguez and the evidence that Inspector Thomas Hernandez left with you." The silence that followed stretched so long that Cross began to wonder if Miguel had retreated deeper into the cabin. When the schoolteacher finally spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of hope and suspicion that Cross recognized from other desperate situations. "Elena Rodriguez is dead. Sheriff Davidson told the whole town that her body was found in the wilderness, killed by the bounty hunter who was tracking her." Miguel's voice cracked slightly. "If you know something different, prove it." Cross felt his blood turn to ice. Garrett had already moved to control the narrative, spreading word of Elena's death to eliminate any hope of rescue or investigation. The strategy was brutally efficient. With Elena officially dead, no one would question her absence or search for evidence she might have possessed. "Elena is alive," Cross called back. "She gave birth to a daughter 3 days ago in an abandoned mine shaft. The baby's name is Esperanza Santos, after her father. Elena wanted you to know that she never married Senator Garrett, that she ran away to protect both you and the child." Another long silence, then the sound of footsteps moving inside the cabin. Cross could hear Miguel wrestling with the implications of what he had been told, trying to decide whether this stranger represented salvation or a more sophisticated trap. "If Elena is truly alive," Miguel said finally, "then tell me something only she would know. Tell me about the poem she recited the night before her father announced her engagement to Garrett." Cross searched his memory for details from Elena's stories about her relationship with Miguel. She had mentioned their conversations about education and politics, their shared dreams for a better future, but nothing about poetry. He was about to admit ignorance when a fragment of memory surfaced, the lullaby Elena had been singing to Esperanza in the mine. "She sang to you," Cross said, taking a calculated risk. "The same song she sings to her daughter now. Dormit, niña, dormit que vino lobo y comera. Sleep, child, sleep now, for the wolf is coming and will devour you." The cabin door swung open fully, and Miguel Santos stepped into the moonlight. He was younger than Cross had expected, perhaps 25, with the lean build of a man who worked with his mind rather than his hands. But there was steel in his posture and intelligence in his dark eyes as he studied the stranger who claimed to bring news of the woman he loved. "Where is she?" Miguel asked, lowering his rifle but not setting it aside. "Safe for now. 3 miles south at the Ramirez homestead. But Garrett's men are closing in, and we need that evidence if we're going to stop them." Cross emerged from his hiding place, moving slowly to avoid triggering any defensive reflexes. "Elena told me about Inspector Hernandez, about the documents he was gathering on Garrett's corruption." Miguel's face hardened at the mention of the inspector. "Thomas was my friend. He was trying to document years of vote buying, intimidation, and murder. Garrett's political machine has been destroying Mexican families throughout this territory, and Thomas was determined to stop it." "Where did he hide the evidence?" Miguel hesitated, studying Cross with the careful attention of a man whose life depended on reading character accurately. "Why should I trust you? How do I know you are not one of Garrett's men, using Elena's safety to manipulate me?" Cross understood the schoolteacher's caution, but they were running out of time. Every hour they delayed gave Garrett more opportunity to consolidate his position and eliminate potential threats. "Because if I were working for Garrett, Elena and her baby would already be dead." Because I burned the contract they gave me to kill her and chose to protect her instead. And because right now, you and I and Elena are the only people standing between Garrett and complete control of this territory." Miguel considered this logic, then nodded slowly. "The evidence is hidden in the school. Thomas gave me a metal strongbox containing documents, photographs, and sworn statements from witnesses. It is concealed beneath the floorboards in my classroom, under the teacher's desk." Cross felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. The evidence still existed, but retrieving it would require entering Silver Ridge itself, where Garrett's men would be watching every approach. How many people know about the hiding place? Only me. Thomas died before he could tell anyone else. And I have been too afraid to retrieve the documents since Sheriff Davidson started asking questions about my whereabouts. Miguel's voice carried the weight of guilt and regret. I should have acted sooner, should have found a way to get the evidence to the territorial authorities. Instead, I have been hiding like a coward while Garrett continues his crimes. You've been staying alive, Cross corrected. Dead men can't testify, and martyrs can't protect the people they love. But now we have a chance to end this, to make sure Thomas Hernandez's death means something. Miguel straightened his shoulders, decision crystallizing in his expression. What do you need me to do? Cross studied the young schoolteacher, recognizing the courage that lay beneath his scholarly exterior. Miguel Santos might not be a fighter in the traditional sense, but he possessed something equally valuable: intimate knowledge of Silver Ridge and complete commitment to protecting his community. First, we get you reunited with Elena. She needs to know you're alive, and we need to plan our next move together. Then we figure out how to get into that school and retrieve the strongbox without getting ourselves killed in the process. They made the journey back to the Ramirez homestead, in careful stages, avoiding the main trails and stopping frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit. Miguel moved through the forest with surprising skill for an educated man, proving that frontier life had taught him practical lessons beyond what any university could provide. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when they finally approached. The adobe house, its windows glowing warm yellow in the pale morning light. Cross could see smoke rising from the chimney and horses in the corral. Normal signs of family life that provided some assurance that Garrett's men had not yet discovered Elena's location. Elena was sitting by the fire nursing Esperanza when Cross and Miguel entered the house. The reunion between the two lovers was everything Cross had hoped to see, Elena's face transforming with joy and relief, Miguel dropping his rifle to gather both mother and child in his arms, tears streaming down both their faces as they whispered endearments in Spanish. I thought you were dead, Elena sobbed against Miguel's chest. Sheriff Davidson told everyone that your body had been found, that you had been killed trying to escape justice. I thought the same about you, Miguel replied, stroking her hair with gentle reverence. When I heard that the bounty hunter had completed his contract, I wanted to die myself. I could not bear the thought that you had suffered because of my cowardice. Cross watched the reunion with mixed emotions. He was genuinely happy to see Elena's joy at discovering Miguel's survival, but he also felt an unexpected pang of loss. Over the past few days, he had begun to think of Elena and Esperanza as his family, his responsibility, his reason for living. Now with Miguel's return, Cross was reminded that he was an outsider to their story, a temporary protector rather than a permanent part of their lives. Maria Ramirez bustled around the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the expanded group while her children watched the emotional reunion with wide-eyed fascination. Carlos stood near the window, maintaining watch over the approaches to the house with the vigilance of a man who understood that their situation remained dangerous despite the night's success. We need to discuss our next move, Cross said when Elena and Miguel had recovered enough to focus on practical matters. The evidence is hidden in the school, but retrieving it will require entering Silver Ridge where Garrett's men are watching for us. Miguel nodded grimly. The school is on the edge of town, near the Mexican Quarter where most of my students live. If we approach carefully, from the back where the creek runs behind the building, we might be able to enter unseen. And then what? Elena asked, still holding Esperanza close. Even if we recover the documents, how do we get them to someone with the authority to act on them? Cross had been considering the same question throughout the night. There's a federal circuit judge named Harrison Webb who's scheduled to hold court in Copper Falls next week. Copper Falls is 2 days' ride from here, and if we can reach Judge Webb with the evidence, if we can reach him alive, Carlos interrupted from his position at the window. Garrett will not allow that evidence to surface. He will use every resource at his disposal to stop us. Then we had better be smarter than his resources, Elena said, with quiet determination. Miguel, how many people in Silver Ridge would support us if they knew the truth about Garrett's crimes? Miguel considered the question carefully. Many of the Mexican families have suffered under Garrett's policies, but they are afraid to speak out. If they knew that someone was finally taking action against him, if they believed we had a real chance of success, He paused, hope growing in his voice. There might be more help available than Garrett realizes. Cross felt a plan beginning to form in his mind. What if we don't try to sneak in and out of Silver Ridge? What if we make this public, force a confrontation that Garrett can't control or cover up? What do you mean? Elena asked. I mean we walk into town in broad daylight, go straight to the school, and recover that evidence in front of witnesses. Make it impossible for Garrett to claim we were never there or that the documents don't exist. Miguel's eyes widened with understanding. You want to turn this into a public challenge to Garrett's authority. Exactly. Bullies like Garrett depend on operating in shadows, on controlling information and intimidating isolated victims. But if we force this into the open, if we make the entire community witness to what we're doing and why, we either succeed completely or die very publicly, Elena finished. There would be no middle ground. Cross nodded. It's dangerous, but it's also our best chance. Garrett can make individuals disappear, but he can't massacre an entire town. Square full of witnesses without destroying his own political future. The plan was audacious, risky, and completely contrary to every tactical principle Cross had learned during his years as a bounty hunter. But as he looked around the room at these people who had become his family, Elena with her quiet courage, Miguel with his passionate idealism, Maria and Carlos with their steadfast loyalty to justice, Cross realized that conventional tactics had never been designed to serve people fighting for something larger than their own survival. When do we do this? Elena asked. Cross checked his pocket watch. Today, this afternoon, when the school lets out and the maximum number of people will be in the streets. We go into Silver Ridge not as fugitives, but as citizens demanding justice. Miguel stood and moved to the window, looking toward the distant town where his life's work waited alongside the evidence that could save or damn them all. There is something else you should know, he said quietly. Sheriff Davidson is not the only law enforcement officer in Garrett's pocket. The federal marshal who covers this territory, a man named Clayton Hendricks, has been taking bribes from Garrett for years. Cross felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. That's why they wanted Elena dead rather than captured. That's why they hired me instead of sending marshals. They couldn't risk a trial because too many people know too much. But Judge Webb doesn't know, Elena said, understanding dawning in her voice. Judge Webb is coming from outside the territory, outside Garrett's sphere of influence. Which means today is our one chance, Cross said grimly. If we wait, if we try to plan this more carefully, Garrett will have time to reach Judge Webb, to poison his mind against our testimony before we can present our evidence. The weight of their situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They were about to attempt something that would either bring justice to their community or get them all killed. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to retreat and try again. Everything depended on the next few hours. Elena looked down at Esperanza, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then up at Miguel and Cross. "My daughter was born in darkness," she said softly, "but she deserves to grow up in the light. Whatever happens today, we do this for her and for all the children who come after her." Cross felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of purpose so complete and absolute that it eliminated all doubt, all fear, all concern for personal survival. He had spent 12 years as a hunter, taking life for money. Today, he would risk his life to give it meaning. "Then let's go bring down a senator," he said outside. The sun climbed higher into a clear blue sky, promising a beautiful day for what might very well be the last stand of 4 people who had chosen justice over safety, truth over survival, and love over fear. The final confrontation was about to begin. The main street of Silver Ridge lay stretched before them like a gauntlet, dusty and broad under the afternoon sun. Daniel Cross rode at the center of their small group, Elena beside him with Esperanza wrapped securely against her chest, Miguel flanking them on the other side. Behind them rode Carlos Ramirez and 3 other Mexican farmers who had chosen to join their cause when word spread through the valley that someone was finally taking a stand against Senator Garrett's tyranny. They had timed their arrival perfectly. School had just been dismissed, and children ran through the streets while their parents gathered in small groups to discuss the day's business. The sight of Elena Rodriguez riding openly through town, a woman officially reported dead, caused conversations to halt and heads to turn. By the time they reached the school building, a crowd of curious onlookers had begun to follow at a respectful distance. Cross dismounted first, his hand resting casually on his gun but making no aggressive moves. The key to their plan was controlling the narrative, making it clear to everyone watching that they were not criminals or raiders, but citizens seeking justice under law. Elena's presence, alive and obviously healthy, contradicted everything Sheriff Davidson had told the community about her fate. "Miguel Santos," called a voice from the growing crowd. "We heard you were dead, that you'd been killed by outlaws." Miguel stepped forward, removing his hat so everyone could see his face clearly. "I am very much alive, Mrs. Patterson. The reports of my death, like the reports of Miss Rodriguez's death, were greatly exaggerated by people who wanted us silenced." A murmur ran through the crowd as more people recognized Elena. Word spread quickly through Silver Ridge's tight-knit community, and Cross could see townspeople hurrying toward the school from every direction. Whatever happened next would have dozens of witnesses, making it impossible for Garrett to deny or distort the truth. Elena dismounted carefully, cradling Esperanza while Miguel moved to assist her. The sight of the baby drew gasps from several women in the crowd, and Cross heard whispered conversations in both English and Spanish as people processed the implications of what they were seeing. "Elena Rodriguez, you are under arrest for theft and fleeing lawful custody." Sheriff Davidson's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. The lawmen emerged from between 2 buildings, flanked by 4 deputies with rifles at the ready. Davidson himself kept his hand on his pistol, but like Cross, he made no move to draw. Too many people were watching. On whose authority? Cross called back, stepping slightly forward to position himself between Elena and the armed men. "Judge Blackwood's? The same judge who authorized a murder contract rather than a legal arrest warrant?" Davidson's face darkened, but he maintained his official composure. "I don't know what lies you've been told, but Miss Rodriguez is wanted on legitimate charges filed by her legal husband, Senator William Garrett." Elena Rodriguez was never legally married to Senator Garrett, Miguel announced loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. "She fled from the ceremony before any vows were exchanged. She owes him nothing and stole nothing that belonged to him." "The territorial courts will decide that," Davidson replied. "Right now she's coming with me." Cross felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Davidson had the legal authority and superior numbers, but the crowd was listening to their version of events with obvious interest. The sheriff was being forced to justify his actions publicly rather than simply exercising power in the shadows. "Before anyone goes anywhere," Cross said, "the people of Silver Ridge deserve to know the truth about what's been happening in their community. Miguel, show them what Inspector Hernandez died trying to expose." Miguel walked to the school's front door, producing the key from his pocket with theatrical deliberation. Inspector Thomas Hernandez came to Silver Ridge 6 months ago to investigate reports of election fraud and voter intimidation. He gathered evidence of systematic corruption that reached from the local level all the way to the territorial government. "That's enough," Davidson snapped, taking a step forward. "I'm placing all of you under arrest for interfering with a lawful investigation." "What investigation?" called out a voice from the crowd. Cross recognized the speaker as Dr. Marcus Webb, one of Silver Ridge's most respected citizens. "Sheriff, most of us haven't heard anything about Inspector Hernandez in months. We were told he completed his work and returned to the territorial capital." Davidson hesitated, clearly caught between his orders to maintain secrecy and the practical necessity of dealing with a crowd that was asking increasingly pointed questions. "The inspector's work is a matter of territorial security. I'm not at liberty to discuss details." Miguel had reached the schoolhouse door and was fitting his key into the lock. "Then let the evidence speak for itself," he called back. "Let the people see what Inspector Hernandez died trying to reveal." "Stop right there." Davidson drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Miguel's back. "Step away from that building." The crowd reacted with shocked murmurs. Several people backed away from the confrontation, but others pressed closer, drawn by the dramatic unfolding of events that had been whispered about for months. Cross could see faces in the crowd, Mexican families who had suffered under Garrett's policies, American settlers who had suspected corruption but lacked proof, merchants and farmers who simply wanted an honest government. "Sheriff," Dr. Webb said firmly, "you're pointing a gun at an unarmed school teacher in front of half the town. I think you'd better have a very good explanation for that." Davidson's hand trembled slightly as he kept his weapon trained on Miguel. Cross could see the lawman wrestling with impossible choices. If he shot Miguel in front of this many witnesses, he would destroy any pretense of legal authority. But if he allowed Miguel to retrieve the evidence, he would be signing his own death warrant when Garrett learned of his failure. "The explanation," said a new voice, "is that Sheriff Davidson has been taking bribes from Senator Garrett for the past 3 years." Everyone turned to see an elderly Mexican man pushing through the crowd. Cross recognized him as Pablo Morales, the former mayor of Silver Ridge who had been forced from office when Garrett's political machine took control of local elections. "Pablo Morales," Davidson snarled, swinging his gun toward the old man. "You were warned to keep your mouth shut." "I was warned, yes. Threatened, beaten, had my home burned and my family terrorized. All because I tried to investigate irregularities in the voting process." Morales stood straight despite his age, facing down the armed sheriff with quiet dignity. "But Inspector Hernandez promised me that the truth would come out eventually. It appears that day has arrived." Miguel had used the distraction to unlock the school door and step inside. Cross heard the sound of furniture being moved and boards being pried up, but he kept his attention focused on Davidson and his deputies. The sheriff was losing control of the situation, and desperate men made dangerous choices. "Elena," Cross said quietly, "take the baby and move toward Dr. Webb. Stay close to the crowd where you'll be protected." Elena nodded and began working her way through the gathered townspeople, who automatically made space for her and the infant. Cross noticed how many people reached out to touch Esperanza's blanket or offer quiet words of blessing. The baby had become a symbol of hope for these people, proof that new life could emerge from darkness and oppression. "I've got it," Miguel's voice carried from inside the school. Moments later, he emerged carrying a metal strongbox that had clearly been hidden for months. The container was wrapped in oilcloth and secured with a heavy lock, suggesting the importance of its contents. Doc Davidson raised his rifle toward Miguel, but Dr. Webb stepped directly into the line of fire. "Sheriff, I'm a federally appointed physician for this territory, and I'm ordering you to stand down. Whatever's in that box, the people have a right to see it." Other townspeople began moving closer, forming a protective barrier on Miguel and the evidence box. Cross recognized the moment when a crowd became something more, when individual people chose to stand together for principles larger than their own safety. This was how revolutions began, not with grand speeches or military campaigns. With ordinary people deciding they had endured enough injustice. Miguel set the strongbox on the school's front steps and produced a small pry bar from his pocket. "Inspector Hernandez sealed this box 6 months ago and gave me the only key before he was murdered. He made me promise to open it only if something happened to him, or if the territorial authorities tried to cover up his findings." The lock snapped open with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent street. Miguel lifted the lid carefully, revealing stacks of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be sworn affidavits. He lifted the first document, an official territorial form with multiple signatures and seals. "This is Inspector Hernandez's preliminary report," Miguel announced, holding the paper high enough for everyone to see. "It documents systematic vote buying in the 1883 territorial election, including payments of $50 per vote to Mexican families who agreed to support Senator Garrett's candidates." An angry murmur ran through the crowd. $50 was more money than most families saw in 6 months, but it was also blood money that had corrupted the democratic process and allowed criminal politicians to buy their way into power. Miguel lifted another document. "This is a sworn statement from Maria Vasquez, who witnessed the murder of her husband Pedro after he refused to sell his vote to Garrett's representatives. Pedro's death was reported as an accident, but Maria saw Sheriff Davidson's deputies beat him to death behind the Silver Ridge Saloon." Davidson's face had gone pale, and his rifle wavered in his hands. Several of his deputies exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the public exposure of crimes they had been ordered to conceal. "And this," Miguel said, producing a photograph, "shows Senator Garrett meeting with known cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, providing them with information about Mexican landowners who could be driven off their property through intimidation and violence." The crowd's mood was shifting from curiosity to anger as the scope of Garrett's corruption became clear. These were not abstract political crimes, but personal attacks on families and individuals that many people had witnessed or suspected, but been powerless to prove. Cross saw Sheriff Davidson's finger tighten on his rifle trigger and knew the moment of crisis had arrived. The lawman was about to choose between exposing himself as a murderer in front of the entire town or allowing evidence to be revealed that would destroy him anyway. "Sheriff," Cross called out, his own hand moving to his gun, "you need to think very carefully about your next move. You can put down that rifle and surrender to federal authority, or you can start a gunfight in front of 40 witnesses including women and children. Either way, your career as a corrupt lawman is over." Davidson's eyes darted around the crowd, looking for support that was clearly not coming. Even his own deputies seemed to be reconsidering their loyalties as the evidence of systematic criminality. Mounted, Dr. Webb stepped closer to the sheriff, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Sheriff Davidson, as a territorial physician, I'm declaring you mentally unfit for duty. Put down your weapon immediately, or I'll have you committed for psychiatric evaluation." The legal threat was probably baseless, but it provided Davidson with a face-saving way to surrender. After a long moment, the sheriff slowly lowered his rifle and let it fall to the dusty street. His deputies followed suit, clearly relieved to avoid a confrontation they could not win, Miguel continued reading from the documents, each revelation building a more complete picture of the corruption that had plagued Silver Ridge for years. There were records of bribes paid to federal marshals, evidence of witness intimidation and murder, and documentation of a conspiracy that reached from local politics to the territorial government itself. The final document, Miguel announced, holding up a letter sealed with official wax, is Inspector Hernandez's formal recommendation to the territorial governor. He recommended the immediate removal of Senator Garrett from office and the appointment of a federal prosecutor to investigate charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The crowd erupted in excited conversation as people processed the implications of what they had heard. Justice was finally within reach, but only if they could protect the evidence and ensure it reached honest authorities. "Where is Senator Garrett?" "Now?" Dr. Webb asked. "He needs to be arrested before he can flee the territory." "Garrett left for the territorial capital 3 days ago," Pablo Morales replied. "But he's scheduled to return tomorrow for a political rally. He has no idea that his crimes have been exposed." Cross felt a surge of satisfaction. Garrett's arrogance and confidence in his own power had led him to maintain his normal schedule, even while his hired guns hunted for Elena and Miguel. The senator would return expecting to find his problems eliminated, only to discover that his entire criminal empire was collapsing. Elena approached the group around the strongbox, still carrying Esperanza but moving with new confidence. The fear and desperation that had marked her flight through the wilderness were gone, replaced by the dignified bearing of a woman who had survived everything her enemies could inflict and emerged victorious. "There's something else you should know," Elena said, addressing the crowd. "Senator Garrett tried to force me into marriage not just to acquire my father's property, but to legitimize his position with the Mexican community. He planned to use my family connections to provide cover for his crimes against Mexican families throughout the territory." She paused, looking around at the faces of people who had suffered under Garrett's oppression. "But I chose to run instead of becoming complicit in his crimes." And Miguel Santos risked his life to preserve the evidence that will bring Garrett to justice. Together, we represent something Garrett never understood, that love and truth are more powerful than money and fear. Cross watched Elena speak and felt his heart swell with pride. This was the woman he had been sent to kill, transformed by courage and motherhood into a leader who could inspire others to stand up for justice. Baby Esperanza stirred in her mother's arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to take in the crowd of people surrounding her with calm acceptance. Dr. Webb stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his position and reputation. "I move that we form a citizens committee to guard this evidence until federal authorities can take custody of it. And I volunteer to ride to Copper Falls myself to notify Circuit Judge Harrison Webb of what we've discovered." "I'll go with you," Cross said. "It's too dangerous for one man to travel alone with information this valuable. And I'll organize the Mexican families to provide security for Elena and Miguel until Garrett is in custody." Pablo Morales added, "We've waited too long for justice. We won't let it slip away now." As the crowd began organizing itself into action committees and security details, Cross felt a profound sense of completion. He had started this journey as a man who sold death for money, isolated from human connection by years of moral compromise. Now he stood in the middle of a community that had chosen to trust him, surrounded by people who had become his family. Elena approached him while the others made their plans. "Daniel," she said softly, "I want you to know that you saved more than just my life and Esperanza's. You saved the lives of everyone in this community who would have suffered under Garrett's continued rule." Cross looked down at Elena and her daughter, then around at the people of Silver Ridge who were preparing to defend the evidence that would bring them justice. "I think it was the other way around," he said. "You and Esperanza saved me. You reminded me what it meant to be worthy of trust, worthy of love." Miguel joined them, the strongbox tucked securely under his arm. "What will you do now?" he asked Cross. "When this is over, when Garrett is in prison and the territory has honest government again," Cross considered the question. A few days ago, his future had seemed clear. Continue taking contracts, continue killing for money, continue the lonely existence that had defined his adult life. Now surrounded by the family he had chosen and been chosen by, different possibilities seemed within reach. "I think," Cross said slowly, "I'd like to help you rebuild the school. Maybe teach some practical skills to go along with reading and writing. Show young people how to protect the community they're going to inherit." Elena smiled, and in that expression, Cross saw approval, acceptance, and something that might eventually become love. "I think Miguel would like that very much. And I think Esperanza will need strong men in her life as she grows up. Men who choose to protect rather than destroy." As the sun set over Silver Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel Cross stood with his new family and watched a community transform itself from victims into citizens. The evidence was secure, federal authorities had been notified, and Senator Garrett's reign of terror was about to end. Cross had traded his rifle for a teacher's slate, his bounty hunter's isolation for a place in a loving family, his pursuit of death for the protection of life. The man who had been sent to shoot a runaway bride had instead chosen to build a future worth living. In his arms, baby Esperanza, hope itself, slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of the world her courage had helped create. A world where justice was stronger than corruption, where love conquered fear, and where even the most lost souls could find their way home. The hunt was over. The protection is complete. The transformation is absolute. Daniel Cross was no longer a man who took life. He had become a man who gave it meaning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard where children's laughter echoed between the newly constructed buildings. Daniel Cross paused in his work, setting down the hammer he'd been using to repair the school's front steps, and watched as Elena emerged from the teacherage, carrying 6-month-old Esperanza on her hip. The baby had grown strong and healthy, her dark eyes now focusing with clear intelligence on the world around her. She babbled constantly, reaching for everything within her grasp with the fearless curiosity of a child who had never known want or danger. Elena had recovered completely from the ordeal of Esperanza's birth, her body regaining its strength while her spirit had grown even more formidable. "Any word from Judge Webb?" Elena asked, settling beside Cross on the steps while Esperanza played with a wooden rattle Miguel had carved for her. Cross nodded toward the official-looking envelope he'd placed carefully on the porch rail. The trial concluded yesterday. Senator Garrett was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Judge Blackwood received 15 years. Sheriff Davidson turned state's evidence and got 5 years plus permanent banishment from law enforcement. Elena closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if finally allowing herself to believe that the nightmare was truly over. And Marshall Hendricks? 10 years and loss of his federal commission. The corruption went deeper than even Inspector Hernandez suspected, but Judge Webb was thorough. Every man who took Garrett's money will face justice. From inside the school came the sound of Miguel's voice, leading his students through their morning recitations. The enrollment had doubled since the scandal broke, with families from across the territory sending their children to learn from the teacher who had risked everything to expose political corruption. Miguel had become something of a folk hero, his story inspiring others to stand up for justice in their own communities. "The territorial governor wants to appoint you as the new federal marshal for this district," Elena said, studying Cross's face for his reaction. Dr. Webb mentioned it when he stopped by yesterday. Cross had been expecting the offer. His role in exposing Garrett's crimes, combined with his reputation as a skilled tracker and investigator, made him an obvious candidate for legitimate law enforcement. But the prospect of wearing a badge again, of returning to the world of official authority and legal responsibility, left him strangely conflicted. What do you think I should do? He asked. Alina shifted Esperanza to her other arm and considered the question seriously. I think you should do whatever brings you peace. You've spent enough years doing things because other people expected them, or because you felt you had no choice. Now you have choices, real ones, and the freedom to make them. Before Cross could respond, a familiar voice called out from the road leading to town. Daniel, Elena, you have visitors. They looked up to see Carlos Ramirez approaching on horseback, leading 2 other riders. As the group drew closer, Cross recognized the second rider as Dr. Webb, but the third was a stranger, a well-dressed woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes that reminded him strongly of someone he couldn't quite place. This is Mrs. Catherine Hernandez, Dr. Webb announced as they dismounted. Inspector Hernandez's widow. She's traveled all the way from Santa Fe to meet the people who brought her husband's killers to justice. Cross stood and removed his hat respectfully. Catherine Hernandez was a small woman, but she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived profound loss and emerged stronger for it. Her dark eyes studied Cross with careful attention before moving to Elena and the baby. Mrs. Santos, she said formally, then smiled. Or may I call you Elena? My husband wrote about you in his letters. He said you were one of the few people in Silver Ridge brave enough to help him gather testimony from frightened families. Elena blushed slightly. Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Hernandez. He died trying to protect people who had no one else to speak for them. Please call me Catherine. And yes, Thomas was always drawn to lost causes and dangerous crusades. I used to worry that his conscience would get him killed someday. Her voice caught slightly. I never imagined I would be grateful for that same conscience, but your courage in preserving his work has given his death meaning. Esperanza chose that moment to reach toward the stranger with bright curiosity, babbling in the universal language of babies everywhere. Catherine's stern expression melted into delight as she gently took the infant's tiny hand. And this must be the hope that was born in darkness, Catherine said softly. Thomas wrote about that too, how new life often emerges from the most difficult circumstances. May I? Elena carefully transferred Esperanza to Catherine's experienced arms. The older woman held the baby with practiced ease, her face transforming as she gazed down at the child who had become a symbol of resilience for the entire community. There's something else, Dr. Webb said, producing an official-looking document from his coat. The territorial government has decided to establish a new position, Special Investigator for Territorial Justice. The role would involve traveling throughout the territory, investigating reports of corruption, and ensuring that what happened here doesn't happen elsewhere. Cross felt Elena's eyes on him as Dr. Webb continued. The position comes with significant authority, a generous salary, and the freedom to operate independently of local political pressures. Governor Martinez specifically requested that we offer it to you, Mr. Cross. It would mean traveling, Cross said slowly, thinking of the implications. Being away from Silver Ridge for weeks at a time. It would also mean protecting families, like the ones Garrett terrorized, Elena said quietly. It would mean making sure other children grow up in communities where justice isn't for sale. Cross looked at Elena, trying to read her expression. And you would be all right with that? With me being gone so often? Elena smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. Daniel, you've already given us our lives back. If you can do the same for other families, other communities, then of course I would be all right with it. Besides, she added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, Miguel and I have been talking about expanding the school, maybe starting a program to train teachers for other frontier towns. We'll have plenty to keep us busy. Catherine Hernandez looked up from her examination of Esperanza with obvious approval. A woman who understands that love means supporting your partner's calling, not limiting it. Thomas would have liked you very much, Elena. Miguel emerged from the school, having dismissed his students for their midday meal. His face brightened when he saw Catherine, and Cross watched as the two of them embraced with the shared grief of people who had lost someone they both loved. "Mrs. Hernandez," Miguel said warmly. "Elena told me you might visit, but I hardly dared hope. How are you managing?" "Better now," Catherine replied honestly. Seeing Thomas's work vindicated, knowing that his sacrifice led to justice, it helps with the grief. And meeting the people he died trying to protect reminds me that some things are worth the ultimate price. She turned back to Cross, her expression serious but hopeful. "Mr. Cross, I hope you'll accept the governor's offer." Thomas believed that good people had a responsibility to stand against corruption wherever they found it. "From what I've heard about your transformation, I think he would have considered you exactly the kind of man he hoped would carry on his work." Cross felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. The offer represented everything he had thought he wanted: legitimate authority, important work, the chance to make a real difference in the world. But it also meant leaving Elena and Esperanza, stepping back into a life of constant travel and potential danger. "I need time to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Dr. Webb replied. "Take all the time you need. The territory has waited this long for honest law enforcement. We can wait a little longer." As the afternoon wore on, the visitors shared stories about Inspector Hernandez and their memories of the investigation that had ultimately cost him his life. Catherine produced photographs and letters that painted a picture of a man driven by an unshakable belief in justice, someone who had chosen to risk everything rather than ignore the suffering of innocent people. Thomas used to say that evil prospered when good people chose comfort over conscience, Catherine told them as the sun began to set. He believed that every person had a moment when they could choose to stand up or turn away, and that those choices defined not just individual character but the moral foundation of entire communities. Cross found himself thinking about his own moment of choice, standing in that mine shaft with Elena and her newborn daughter. He had turned away from violence and embraced protection, but was that enough? Did his transformation carry with it an obligation to help others facing similar choices? That evening, after Catherine and Dr. Webb had departed for town, Cross walked alone through the streets of Silver Ridge. The community had transformed dramatically in the months since Garrett's downfall. Mexican families no longer looked over their shoulders when they walked to market. Children played freely in streets that had once been patrolled by corrupt deputies. The school had been rebuilt and expanded, while new businesses opened to serve a population that was finally free to prosper. He found Elena sitting on the porch of their small house, nursing Esperanza while Miguel graded papers by lamplight inside. The domestic scene filled Cross with a contentment he had never experienced during his years as a bounty hunter, but it also highlighted the choice that lay before him. "You've already decided, haven't you?" Elena said without looking up from the baby. Cross settled beside her on the porch steps. "I think I have. But I want to make sure you understand what it would mean. It would mean that other women like me might not have to run for their lives. It would mean that other babies might be born in safety instead of abandoned mine shafts. It would mean that corruption and violence wouldn't go unchallenged just because the victims are too powerless to fight back alone." Elena finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside the house. "Daniel, I fell in love with the man who chose to protect rather than destroy. If you turn away from that calling now, if you choose safety over service, you wouldn't be the same man anymore." Cross felt the last of his uncertainty fade away. Elena was right. His transformation wasn't complete until he chose to use his skills and experience in service of something larger than his own happiness. The territory needed someone who understood both the criminal mind and the courage required to stand against corruption. "Then I'll take the position," he said. "But only if you and Miguel will consider expanding your school program to include training for law enforcement officers." The territory needs honest lawmen as much as it needs honest teachers. Elena smiled and leaned against his shoulder. I think that's exactly what Inspector Hernandez would have hoped for, justice and education working together to build a better future. Inside the house, Esperanza made a small sound of contentment, and Cross realized that his own transformation had come full circle. He had begun as a man who took life for money, become a protector of the innocent, and was now choosing to become a guardian of justice itself. The hunt was over. The protection was secure. The new beginning had truly begun. Daniel Cross would no longer be just a man who had chosen love over violence. He would be living proof that redemption was possible, that people could change, and that sometimes the most broken souls could become the strongest. Defenders of hope. As he sat with Elena and their sleeping daughter under the vast Montana sky, Cross felt the weight of his past finally lift from his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new criminals to track, new communities to protect. But tonight, he was simply a man who had found his way home to love, family, and purpose. The transformation was complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.